Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Shireen Ash. I'm a librarian from the Marin County Free Library. I'm happy to welcome you here to this talk on the secret life of bees with James Campbell of the Marin Master Gardeners Program. So just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. I'm going to ask everyone to stay muted during the program. We're a large group, and I expect we'll be getting larger. This way we can kind of manage our sound well. The program is being recorded. It will be posted on the Marin County Free Library YouTube site within 2 weeks, barring any technical difficulties that surprised us. But there you can find other Marin Master Gardener programs, and I'll pop that link into the chat, but you can also just jump onto YouTube, type in Marin County Free Library, and you'll see all our programs. I'm going to ask everyone to stay muted, as I said, during the program, and questions and answers can go in the chat, and I will read them at the end of James's presentation, and he will have an opportunity to answer them then. So as you think of things, pop it in the chat, and I'll be sure to get to it. So let's get started with The Secret Life of Bees with James Campbell. James is a beekeeper since 2008. He's been a Marin Master Gardener since 2010. Initially, this started as a hobby, grew into a passion. He's very knowledgeable. He's got a lot of information to share with us. So I will disappear. I'll see you when the program's over for question and answers. And James, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Shireen, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon. I see a lot of fellow Master Gardeners, but for those of you who aren't Master Gardeners or aren't really sure who we are, there's some information up on the screen, but I'd encourage you to visit our website. We have a lot of great information there for home gardeners and information about how you could become a Master Gardener. Also, a place to sign up for our newsletter, the leaflet, which has lots of great information in it. So my talk is about bees in general. I am a beekeeper, but I'm not really going to be talking about the art of beekeeping or the obsession of beekeeping. I'm really going to be talking about bees in general, the whole of bees. And for a lot of people, when they think of bees, they think of honeybees, but actually honeybees are just a small piece of the big bee family. Now I see, there we go. Okay, so this is what we'll cover here. Today we're going to talk a little bit about, how bees are different from maybe what you think of when you think of bees. And the reason we're going to talk about bees is because bees pollinate about 80% of the world's flowering plants and 75% of the fruits, nuts, and vegetables grown in the United States. But not all this work is done by honeybees. And if you think about it, honeybees are European cousins who were imported to the United States. But before we were even a United States, we had a lot of native flowers and nuts and vegetables that were pollinated not by honeybees, but by our native bees. So if you think about cranberries and blueberries, pawpaw, squashes, beans, those were all pollinated by our native bees, or sometimes I'll refer to them as our solitary bees and bumblebees. So as I mentioned earlier, and I really want to put a kind of an underline under this, honeybees make up a small portion of the total bee population. They would fall in this orange part of the pie here, and those are what we would call our social bees that live in, multi-generational situations. But most bees, the majority here in California and all over the world, are what we call solitary or native bees. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what that means. So the solitary bees have an annual life cycle. Generally, they emerge from their nests in the spring. The males emerge first, and after feeding, they hang around the nest waiting for the females. Once the mating is complete, the males die fairly quickly. They have a short life of eating and making merry, and then they're done. After mating, though, the females will begin the process of nesting. They select a suitable site and construct the nest. And these nests can either be in the ground or in hollows in trees or old stalks. They typically, though, most of them are ground nesters. And after they've constructed their nests, they start laying anything between 1 and 20 eggs. The eggs will hatch into larvae, which feed on the pollen and nectar that the female has stored in each nest. They call that combination of pollen and nectar bee bread. The larvae develop and pupate, and then they emerge the following spring or a little bit later, depending on the species. And the whole cycle for the solitary bees begin again, with the men coming out first and foraging and waiting for the females to emerge, and the mating ritual begins again. So social bees are really different. Social bees live multi-generationally. That means that the queen will lay overlapping generations. And so I'm going to tell you, really, in California, there's kind of two social bee groups that we would be familiar with. One of them is the honeybee, which is an imported bee, and the other would be bumblebees, which would be native bees to California. The bumblebees are also live an annual life cycle, like the solitary bees we talked about. That means their entire lifespan happens in 1 year. The annual life cycle of the bumblebee is slightly different from that of the solitary bee, because the queens mate in the late summer when they are new queens. So rather than mating in the spring, these ones mate in the late summer before they go into hibernation. The males die pretty much right after they've had the chance to mate in the early autumn. A lot of them never get the chance, so they're sort of disposable in that way. And then after having hibernated for the long winter, the queens, the fertilized queens, will emerge in the spring, and they're very hungry, so they go out and build up their reserves again, and they hunt for a nesting site to lay their eggs. The queen alone rears the first brood of the offspring. She keeps the eggs warm, and she sips from nectar that she has stored in wax cups to keep up her energy. In a few days, the larvae emerge, and the queen forages, feeding them a mixture of nectar and pollen, the bee bread I was talking about earlier. After about 2 weeks, they cocoon and then emerge as adult worker bees. Some will stay in the nest of the bumblebee, and they will clean up the nest and rear new eggs that the queen is laying. And others will have the job of foraging for nectar and pollen. So they'll leave the nest to go bring back food that's needed to keep everybody healthy and alive. The queen never leaves her nest again, and she will remain laying eggs in the colony, and the colony will grow steadily until at the end of the summer, new queens and new male drones will emerge and mate. Because the bumblebees have an annual life cycle, they generally only occupy their nest sites for 1 year. The repeated use of the same nest site would happen only by chance, as overwintering queens do not spend the winter in the nests that they were born in. So honeybees are the other social bees that we're aware of. And the lifespan of the honeybee varies depending on the role that bee is playing in the colony. Honeybees live in sophisticated, well-organized colonies. They are superorganisms. A honeybee colony could be comprised of between 50,000 and 60,000 bees, and they each perform different roles in order to help ensure the smooth running and success of the colony. The role of a bee, as well as the time of year in which it was born, whether that be spring, summer, autumn, is also a factor in the lifespan for worker bees in the colonies. Worker bees born in the spring or summer have a lot shorter lives, but they're also much busier. While the worker bees born in the autumn may live longer, but they have to survive a harsh winter conditions to emerge from the hive in the following spring. So if you're a worker bee and you're born in the spring or summer, your lifespan's about 6 or 7 weeks long. It's pretty short. It took you about 21 days to mature from an egg into an adult bee. If you're an autumn-born worker, you might live 4 to 6 months. The queen can live 3 to 6 years, and she takes about 16 days to mature from an egg to an adult queen. The drones, which are the male bees, take about a lifespan of about 55 days, and they take about 24 days to mature from egg to adult. The worker bees are the majority of bees that we find in a colony. They make up 99% of the hive, and they house a multitude of responsibilities, all of which change with their different phases of life. There are about 7 different jobs a worker bee will have to be responsible for in her lifetime, although not all bees will do every single job. First, a worker bee who needs to clean her cell and remove any bodily waste left from the coming out of the egg in order to prepare the cell for the next egg. This cleaner role lasts about 2 weeks. After that, the bees will then move on to the next job. And one of the first ones they'll probably get is something called the undertaker. The undertaker is when they clean out the dead bodies or unhealthy bees and remove them from the hive to prevent diseases. A young worker bee can then become a nurse bee, and what they do is help feed the young larvae. And after they outgrow their role of nursing larvae, some worker bees may become the queen's attendant. Most of their work attending to the queen merely consists of cleaning her, feeding her, and removing the waste that is around her. Another worker bee job is the honey maker. They collect nectar from the forager bees brought back to the hive and put it into cells and work hard to transform that nectar into honey. Some bees might become wax maker bees. They use the glands in their abdomen to build honeycomb or to seal up cells once an egg has been placed inside, or to close a cell that is full of honey. Once a worker bee has matured enough, they will move on from the more simple in-hive jobs to the more difficult jobs outside the hive. Bees can become guard bees, in which case their job is to protect the entrance of the hive from invaders like mice or wasps. The bee will then gradually graduate, basically, to the most difficult job at the end of their lives, and that's the forager bee job. That's where they will collect nectar and pollen and bring it back to the hive. When they leave the hive for the first time, they do this dance so that they familiarize themselves with their new surroundings and where the location of the hive is, and that helps them to find their way home. The new queens, when they're born, basically mate once in their life, although unlike the solitary bees, they can mate with multiple partners. And in fact, a stronger hive usually has a queen that's mated with multiple partners. She will then go into the hive and lay eggs for the rest of her life, unless the hive tries to supersede her. And this often happens if the worker bees decide the queen isn't producing enough eggs, or if she's gotten older, or if she's ill. And what they end up doing is they feed some of the eggs more what they call royal jelly. And that royal jelly is what makes a bee develop into a queen as opposed to just a worker bee. So they can work on multiple queen cells at the same time. But once those queens start emerging, there can really be only one queen in the hive. So a couple of things can happen. Either she'll kill the other queens, or one of the queens will escape the hive and bring a lot of the workers with her, and that's called a swarm. So the next thing we're going to talk about are sort of the foraging habits of bees. And when I'm talking about foraging habits, I'm talking about what kind of pollen they're going to look for. So you can divide this category into two types of bees, although each one has a lot of bees in the category. That's the specialist bees and the generalist bees. Specialist bees make up about 44% of the bees in California. And they can be one of two kinds of specialist bees. One kind is called monoglectic, and this is really a rare type of mutualism, because monoglectic bees really only collect pollen from one kind of flower, just one kind. And so it's a super rare situation, but it does exist. The other specialist bees are what we call oleoglectic bees. And that means that they will have a relationship with flowers of specific family of plants. So I have some examples here, and one of them is the squash bee. And this is a specialist bee family that there's about 20 varieties of gourd and squash bees. And they've kind of evolved in a special way so that they're good pollinators for squash plants. And I don't know if anyone's ever kind of gotten squash pollen on themselves, or for me, when I'm not having a lot of zucchini luck, I'll bring out a Q-tip and try to self-pollinate. But the pollen grains for squash plants are really, really large. So these bees have evolved to have their hairs or their scopa on their body unbranched. Like most bees have branched scopa that helps them collect a lot of pollen. These bees have unbranched hair, which allows them to carry the big grains of pollen on their bodies. And another unusual trait about these bees is that they have very large ocelli. And ocelli are these sort of three eyes on their head that are not sight eyes, but they're light eyes. They can detect light. They have the two eyes on the side of their head that we see, which form images. And then they have these ocelli on their head, and all bees do, which helps them sort of determine light levels. And so with these squash bees, they have really large ocelli, which allows them to travel at night and early in the morning. Because if you think about it, squash blossoms are really in their prime in the really early morning. And most bees don't really want to come out of their nest or their hive until it's kind of warmed up. So that's why these are specialists for squash blossoms. The other bee here I have is the sunflower bee. And they are cute looking guys, girls. So sunflowers are really popular with all kinds of bees. I don't know if any of you remember a project a few years ago called the Great Sunflower Project, but it was a citizen science project where they asked you to plant a specific sunflower, and then they asked you to count how many bee visitors went to that sunflower in a certain hour of the day. So that was done by a friend of ours called Gretchen Labune, who's a professor at San Francisco State. And no matter how many sunflowers you have, you will have a sunflower bee. They always look for that plant, but generalist bees can also pollinate sunflowers. And the same with squash bees. You'll see honeybees there as well. So generalist bees are different because they're opportunistic foragers. They're called polyglectic. And that means they can basically forage pollen from a wide variety of plants. They don't have to go to any sort of special preferred plant. They will, go to any plant that they see. They often practice something though called flower constancy. Flower constancy is displayed when a pollinator will consistently choose some plant species over others, even though some plant varieties are closer by in the same area, and they might even provide more nectar or pollen, but they're bypassed by the pollinator, who is remaining faithful to the plant of its choice. Pollinators can show flower constancy within an individual foraging trip, or sometimes even over a whole day, or sometimes for their entire life lifespan. So the flower constancy has something to do with the way the memory works in bees, and like us as well. They have a long-term and a short-term memory. And for some reason, they can only memorize the structure of a flower in their short-term memory. In their long-term memory, they can remember where their nest and hive is, but when it comes to flower structures, they can only sort of keep it in their short-term memory. So that keeps them going to the same kind of flower, which is a pretty good thing because, as we all know, if you took pollen from a lavender plant and your next visit was to a poppy, you probably would not have successful pollination. So flowers are really interesting because we enjoy them so much as people, but they're really beautiful and smell good and are really basically advertisements for pollinators. Everything they do is to attract pollinators. They want to brand themselves with the pollinator. They want the pollinator to have a really nice user experience with the flower, and they want to be remembered, and they want the pollinators to come back again and again and again. And one of the ways flowers accomplish this is by something we call honey or nectar guides. And these are the markings that we see on some flower petals that essentially direct a bee where to go to find the nectar reward, the nectary. And they often lead them by the reproductive parts so that they pick up some pollen on their way. So the flowers are very smart in the way they kind of figured that out and how they can ensure their pollination. But the majority of flowers don't have what we see as visible honey or nectar guides, but they do have honey or nectar guides. We just don't see them because as humans, we don't have the ability to see UV, whereas bees do see UV. And so here I have a picture of a flannel bush fremontodendron flower as we see it, which is sort of just all yellow. But over on the other side is a picture that was taken with a UV light shined on it. And you can see it has some of these markings that I'm talking about that would direct a bee where to go. Here is a monkey flower or mimulus, and the same. the way we see it versus how a bee would see it. So most nectar guides are ultraviolet and invisible to our eye, but they're seen by bees who see a different part of the color spectrum. They see blue, green, and ultraviolet. We see red, green, and blue, but we don't see ultraviolet. Nectar guides turn out to be a win-win for flowers and for bees because it makes the pollination more efficient. The bee knows exactly where to go to get what it's looking for. And scientists have also found that flowers with honey or nectar guides are far less likely to be robbed. And when I talk about robbing from a flower, it's when nectar robbing is when a bee makes a hole in the side of the corolla of a flower. And the corolla is just that whole section of petals and bypasses the reproductive organs just to go directly to the nectary. So nectar guides or honey guides are not the only way that flowers have evolved to be helpful to the bee pollinators. Another way is something called papillate conical cells. And these are little bumps on the petals of flowers that we could not possibly see with our eyes, but they're there. And these have basically evolved to function something like in a mechanical way, a little bit like Velcro. It helps pollinators stick the landing. So, you know, if you think about it, not all flowers are just sitting there in a kind of flat, easy to land on space. They could be moving in the wind or hanging upside down or sideways. And so these papillate conical cells provide something for the bees to sort of latch onto when they land to pollinate. And at first, scientists weren't 100% sure what these papillate conical cells function was because they also help make the flowers more iridescent. They helped with temperature regulation. But two studies that were done made it pretty clear that the main function of the papillate conical cells was to help bee pollinators stick the landing. In one of these studies, they found some mutant snapdragons, which did not have papillate conical cells, and they ended up mixing them up with normal snapdragons. And they observed that the bumblebees discriminated against the snapdragons that did not have these papillate conical cells, even though they were all in the same field of flowers. In another study, a flower called the Macronesian lotus basically lost its native bee pollinator, and the pollination of that flower was taken over by bees. And in just a couple generations, the petals of the Macronesian lotus flower stopped making papillate conical cells. They completely stopped being a part of the flower's anatomy. So pollination. Pollination is usually an unintended consequence of an animal's activity on a flower. Pollination occurs with the transfer of pollen from the male parts of the flower to the female parts of a flower of the same species. This results in fertilization of the plant ovaries and the production of seeds. Bees make excellent pollinators because most of their life is spent collecting pollen. They use pollen as a source of protein that they use to develop their youngins. And so when a bee lands on a flower, the hairs all over the bee's body attract pollen grains through electrostatic forces. They have stiff hairs on their legs that enable them to groom the pollen with specialized brushes and pockets, which we call corbicula. And those pockets are found on their hind legs. They carry it back to their nest, and there they feed their young. Solitary bees do not have these pollen baskets that we do find on bumblebees and honeybees, but they transport the pollen on the sticky hairs on their hind legs, which are called scopal hairs. As I mentioned, individual bees tend to focus on one kind of flower at a time, which is flower constancy. And it means that it's more likely that pollen from one flower will be transferred to another flower of the same species. The business of collecting pollen takes a lot of energy. So many flowers attract and reward bees with nectar. A mixture of water and sugar is produced by the plant that the bee uses for energy. So I was talking a little bit about the electrostatic fun between bees and flowers. So they use electricity to help each other out. So when a bee's flying through the air, it's losing electrons and it's building up a positive charge. This happens because as they fly, the friction between their bodies and the air molecules rubs off the electrons on and the flowers, which are grounded, have a low negative charge. So it's sort of, if you remember what it was like when you rubbed a balloon on your head, you're basically taking electrons off one thing, and you know what happens there. So when a positively charged bee lands on a negatively charged flower, two things happen. One thing is the pollen is attracted to the positively charged bee, so it sort of just jumps onto the bee. It's like when you're taking clothes out of the dryer and they've been rubbing together, sometimes they'll stick together because they've created two opposing charges. Just think of what happens with two magnets that have a positive and a negative charge. They're just drawn to each other. So that's what happens with the pollen when a bee lands on a flower. The other thing that happens is that when the bee is collecting the pollen and its nectar on a flower, it also changes the charge of the flower for a short time. So that low negatively charged flower suddenly picks up a positive charge from the visit from the bee. And so what happens when the next bee comes along is that they'll feel that charge. So it's sort of like when you have two magnets that are negative or positive and you try to push them together, they kind of push each other away. And that's one of the ways that a flower will basically alert a bee that, we just have been visited, so we don't have a nectar for you right now. And it only lasts a short time, about the same number of seconds that it takes for the nectary to refill its glands. It's interesting because there's so many ways that bees kind of let other bees know not to waste their time at a flower. You might have heard this kind of joke that bumblebees have smelly feet. And they say that because bumblebees secrete a substance whenever they touch their feet to a surface. And it's like us leaving fingerprints or on whatever we touch. They're basically marking flowers and letting the next bee know that they've already been stripped of their pollen and nectar. And so they're not to waste their time. A really specialized kind of pollination that not all bees can do is called buzz pollination or sonication. And what this is a technique used by some bees to release pollen that is tightly packed in the anther. So on most flowers, we can see the pollen because it's on the outside of the anther and you can touch it and it comes off really easily. But with some flowers, the pollen's actually inside the anther and you can't touch it on the outside of the anther. It has to come through a little hole in the anther. And this is true for all these plants I have listed on here, including tomatoes and potatoes and cranberries and blueberries and eggplants and manzanita. And so what happens is the bee basically attaches itself to the anther of the flower and it sort of detaches its wings and it starts vibrating. And so this vibration is called a sonication. And when it does that, it starts shaking the anther in a way that it's sort of like that little hole becomes like a pepper shaker. Suddenly the pollen will start being released from that anther. And it's really interesting. I saw one video of someone who hit a tuning fork. If you know what those are, they're look like wishbones and you hit them and they start vibrating and they touched an anther with the tuning fork. And that same vibration caused the anther to spew out its pollen. Okay, so next slide. So pollen, I know like me, you kind of think pollen is pollen is pollen is pollen, but as it turns out, pollen is not all the same. And as you can see from this slide, which is some microscopic views of different kinds of pollen, they actually come in a lot of different shapes and sizes and colors. If you are a beekeeper here, you've probably noticed that when your bees come back and their little bee baskets or corbicula on their back legs are full of pollen, those can come back in different colors sometime. But it turns out pollen is quite a varied plant product. It's rich in biologically active substances. In fact, 200 substances were found in pollen grains from different plant species. In the group of basic chemical substances, there are proteins, amino acids, carbohydrates, lipids, fatty acids, phenolic compounds, enzymes, and coenzymes, as well as vitamins and other bioelements. This is, as I mentioned, the protein source for bees that they use to feed their larvae and help them grow into adulthood. So nectar, as I mentioned before, nectar is basically sugar water, and it's produced in a part of the plant called the nectary, or sometimes called the nectarine, which I think is, why we might call a nectarine, because it's just full of that sugary water that we love. And bees feed on both the nectar and the pollen. The nectar is used for energy, and as I mentioned, the pollen provides protein and other nutrients. When they combine the two together, they call that bee bread. And here is a really good illustration of the thing I was talking about before when I mentioned nectar robbing. And so this happens when a bee basically has a short tongue, and it goes up to a flower with a long corolla or long petals of the flower. And so it can't really reach the nectar gland through the corolla of the flower. So what they do, if their tongue is too short and they have strong mandibles, is they bite a hole at the base of the flower, like this little gal has, and then they can reach right into the nectary with their tongue. But the downside to this way of getting nectar is they haven't pollinated any of the flower in the process. They've completely skipped the anther and the stigma, and so pollination hasn't really happened. Okay, my next slide. So making honey. So it's interesting because honeybees are really technically the only bees that make honey, and make honey that we think of as honey. Sometimes you'll see references to bumblebees making honey, but it's not the honey that we know that honeybees make, because this is a pretty interesting process that they go through. So they basically collect the nectar from the flowers, and they have two stomachs. Honeybees have two stomachs. They have a regular stomach that they use to nourish themselves, and then they have what they call a honey stomach, or a crop, which is something that they use to transport nectar and sometimes just water back to their hive. So what happens is they'll take some nectar into their honey stomach or crop, and in that honey stomach, the nectar will kind of slosh around with some enzymes, and that changes the chemical structure of the sugar water from sucrose, and it breaks it down into glucose and fructose. They also end up changing the pH, which the pH for honey is a kind of acidic one, but for nectar it varies from 4.2 to 8.7, so it can actually be an alkaline. Some nectars are alkaline. So what happens is they get this nectar in their honey crop or honey belly. It's sloshing around in there with the different enzymes that are breaking it down and changing the pH. And then they'll go back to their hive, and they'll basically regurgitate the contents of their honey stomach to another worker bee. And that other worker bee is the honey worker bees that we talked about a little bit earlier. So they'll take that regurgitated nectar into their own honey crop or stomach, and the process continues. And basically they'll get it into the honeycomb. And when it's nectar, it's about 80% water content. And then when the bee puts the honey solution into the comb, it's about a 20% water content. And then they do this thing where they flap their wings and they evaporate more water out of the honey solution. And they get it down to about 17 or 16% water, which is super saturated and why sometimes honey crystallizes. And when it gets down to that very saturated form of nectar, or not nectar anymore because it's been changed, that's when it becomes honey. And when it's fully cured, they'll cap it, and it can last a really long time. So I have this slide up, and I'll just ask you all, I don't know if you have a pen or paper, but one of the things I've noticed a lot of people come to this talk for, or they're going to ask me after the talk, is what should I plant? And the list of what we should plant for our pollinators is varied. It varies depending on where you live in the Bay. But this site, which is run by UC Berkeley, is done by, it's a kind of a open air lab done by Professor Gordon Franke, and they call it the Urban Bee Lab. And they basically study our pollinator bees here in the Bay Area there, and they have a tremendous list of really great plant selections. They'll tell you exactly what to plant. You can take a good look at it. You can take your time kind of looking at their list and checking them out at your favorite nursery. This is really a fantastic resource for what to plant to attract pollinators to your garden. But I am going to share with you a few rules of thumb that they've learned here at the Urban Bee Lab or the Oxford track at Berkeley, University of Berkeley. And this is ways that you can think about gardening at your own home to attract more pollinators. So one of the first rules is to plant in large patches of a single flower type. And if you think about the way it works in nature when you're hiking or out, wildflowers grow in huge patches of the same flower. And as I mentioned, flowers and bees are all about efficient pollinating, and they practice something we call flower constancy. So if you have a lot of the same type of flower in one spot, that's going to be a favored spot for pollinators and bees to come to because they can practice their flower constancy. They can get pollen and from the same flowers that are all close together. So on one trip, they can kind of do one-stop shopping. So the rule of thumb here is when they say a big patch, they mean a big patch that's about 3 feet in diameter, and they've noticed that even in this bee garden with the same type of flower, if they have patches that are smaller than 3 feet in diameter in the same garden, same flower, the ones that are smaller groupings of the flower are far less visited by the bees. So that's one really important lesson for us all, that if we want to plant in our garden and attract pollinators, we should do big swaths of flowers. They really like that. And, I don't know what you've observed in your garden, but I know that if I have any flowering fruit trees, or I have a pittosporum that is in flower a little bit later in the summer than other things, and it's covered with bees. And that's because it's all the same kind of flower in one spot. And that's exactly what bees love. We should also remember that native bees are more likely to forage on native plants. So the more diversity of plants you put in your garden, the better. There are many attractive non-native species, but you should be really careful about what you choose, because some of these flowers have been bred for their beauty, but not their beauty for pollinators. So roses, for example, are not good bee plants because a lot of them have been produced to have showy petals, but those petals have replaced the anthers, which is where they would be collecting the pollen. So another thing we want to remember in our gardens, and both of these photos are a garden I work on here in Tiburon, California. It's called Harvey's Garden. And Harvey knew what he was doing because he planted a lot of natives and he planted in big swatches of flowers. But you basically want to provide continuous blooms. Bees need floral resources, that's the pollen and nectar, all year long. Adults feed on the sugary nectar for energy, and the pollen they collect is a protein, vitamin-rich source, as I've mentioned, that they feed their young. And pollen and nectar combined form bee loaf, as I mentioned too. Bees have seasonal emergency patterns, which means that different species emerge from their nests at different times of the year. Some species emerge at the very early spring, as early as February and March, which is why a lot of our native California plants are really good for them. Whereas others come out later in the spring as well, in the summer and early fall. Some native bees have timed their emergence with the bloom of the native flowers they prefer to forage on, but they'll also visit non-native ornamental flowers that are in bloom at the same time. So the rule of thumb here is to try to incorporate at least 15 or 20 different species in even the smallest garden. At the peak time when most flowers are available is the late spring and early summer. This also corresponds when we have the highest diversity of bees in our gardens. California natives tend to flower more early in the spring and summer, whereas non-native ornamental bloom mainly in the late summer or fall. Zauschneria californica, though, is a great native that does, I think they changed the name of it actually. California, well, anyway, they're always changing plant names. There is a good native plant that flowers later in the fall. Pollinating nectar plants are most abundant. The more you have blooming, the more likely you're going to get pollinator visitors. Another rule of thumb to attract pollinators to your garden is to leave some bare ground. As I mentioned, the vast majority of bees are our native species bees, and the vast majority of those actually nest in the ground. So we've learned that one of the things that they don't like is mulch, and it's a little bit of a hard thing for us because we are in drought situation more often than not in California, and mulch is a big help to keep moisture in the ground and to keep weeds down. But if you can, and you should be leaving spaces around your trees mulch free, that's a good place for bees to find ground nesting. Excuse me. In the Gordon Frankie's urban bee garden, he also has just oak barrels filled with sand and dirt as ground nesting places. You can also set up some of these bee blocks, as they call them. At the urban bee garden, they actually put them under umbrellas, but you could place them under trees or under the eaves of your house. You really want them to be out of the rain and out of the direct sun. Another thing that all animals need, and not surprisingly, bees need, is water. And whereas honeybees can bring water back to their hive, they use the honey crop or honey stomach I was telling you about to bring water back to the hive. Most bees, solitary bees, need to find a place to sip water. So when we all irrigated more often, you'd see a lot of runoff, and you could often see bees kind of sipping from that. But that's going to be a lot of a less reliable source for them. So here are a few suggestions of ways you could bring water into your garden in a simple way. Maybe under your hose bib or wherever water is coming out every so often, you could place a shallow dish and put some marbles or pebbles or rocks in it. The thing about bees is they drown pretty easily, so you want to give them a place to sit while they're drinking. Another suggestion is a bucket with some kind of floating islands using corks or sponges or peanuts, those horrible packing peanuts. But anyway, if you can bring water into your garden for the bees, it's a huge help, especially during this drought and when nectar is not flowing, they get really thirsty. So I'm going to talk now about some of the diseases affecting bees. And I just want to take a moment to say there's not as much science about how these bee diseases are affecting our native pollinators, even though they're the vast majority of bees making our planet possible. There's a lot of human and science interest in honeybees because we sort of have the most intimate relationship with them for so many centuries now. We've always wanted their wax and their honey, and we've been able to manage them. So we have a really intertwined relationship with honeybees. But so we've learned a lot about the diseases affecting bees, especially since the advent of colony collapse disorder. But we don't know as much about what is happening to native bees and solitary bees, but we do know that they are declining and a lot of those species are going extinct. In fact, here in California, not so long ago, the most common bumblebee was the Bombus occidentalis, the western bumblebee, and now it's almost extinct in California, and that's just been within the last 15 years. So there's a lot of different things that attack bees, but I'm going to go through these one by one. So viral pathogens. So viruses there's approximately 20 known honeybee viruses. And these viruses spread when healthy bees interact with infected nestmates or contaminated food. The viruses are also transmitted between drones and queens when they're mating. They can also be transmitted between the queens and their offspring during the time she's laying eggs. Hive pests, parasites, also carry viruses. So we're going to get to the Varoa mite, but they also are virus carriers that bring viruses into honeybee hives. Infected bees exhibit a range of symptoms when they're virally infected, and depending on the virus and the severity of the infection, some viruses disproportionately affect certain honeybee castes and at certain developmental stages. Interestingly, many viruses that infect honeybees are found in other insect species. Deformed wing virus, which is what this is a picture of, not only infects honeybees, but has also been found in other bumblebee species. So I think about 20 other species are affected by the deformed wing virus. Relatively little is known about the damage caused by honeybee viruses outside of the honeybee hives, but experiments have shown that viruses can spread between bee species through shared habitat. So for example, when an infected honeybee sheds viral particles on a flower, another bee species, like one of our not native or solitary bee species, can come along and they are exposed to that virus, and then they bring it back to their nests. So it's sort of spreading interspeciesly, bee species wise. So some of what we know about the honeybees we're now learning is actually affecting the native bees as well. And the deformed wing virus essentially is a virus that affects the development of the wings of the bee. And so if they're not able to fly, they can perform some of the hive duties, but they never become the foragers in their lifespan. So Varoa mites are one of these parasitic mites that I was talking about that actually also bring viruses into the hive. The thing about the Varroa mite, it's called the Varroa destructor, and it really is. And when I first was giving this talk and first learning about beekeeping, it was believed that these mites basically attached themselves to the bees and fed off the bee blood, or the hemolymph. But a really interesting thing happened a few years ago. This young boy who grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, was deathly afraid of insects. So his parents said, you can't be afraid of insects, you have to learn about them. So he started studying about them. And his name is Samuel Ramsey. And he went on to pursue his PhD at the University of Maryland. And he thought it was interesting that there was this common belief that these Varroa mites were feeding off the hemolymph, or the blood of bees, but no one could recreate this in a laboratory setting. So he started studying it more, and he discovered that the Varroa mite is actually feeding on something called the vitellogenin in a bee's body. And that's basically a bee's fat body. And so, what is a bee's fat body, right? Well, a bee's fat body is something that they use. I think I explained earlier that in the summer and spring, a bee only lasts 6 to 7 weeks. But in the winter, a bee has to last, 4 to 6 months, because their whole job for the whole winter long is not to go out and forage or do any of that. They're basically there to survive and to keep the queen warm. They want to keep that internal cluster of the beehive at 92 degrees all winter long. So what they do is they go in there and they just sort of flap their wings and create body heat to keep the queen alive through the winter. And so they do this with these kind of fat bodies, or the vitellogelin. And what this vitellogelin is made up of, it's called a glycolipoprotein. So glyco, sugar, lipo, fat, and protein. It's kind of like the perfect food. So what happens if you're a beekeeper out there and when you tend to lose your hive, bees tend to collapse in the late fall or early winter, and that's because the bees' fat bodies have basically been eaten by these Varroa mites, so they just don't have the stores they need to survive through the winter anymore. Okay, so another crazy parasite of bees is something called what we call zombie bees. And this was discovered right here in California. And zombie bees were discovered by a professor at the University or San Francisco State in San Francisco. And he used to find these kind of dizzy bees just kind of going in circles on the campus of the San Francisco State. And he has praying mantises at home. So he would collect these bees in a vial and bring them home to feed his praying mantis. And then one weekend he forgot and he left the vial on his desk. And when he came back, the vial was full of all these little larvae. And so he basically discovered that this fly called and you can see it here, called the Pachycephalus borealis, basically sticks its ovodepositor into the body of the bee, and it lays its eggs. So the bee basically acts as the incubator for these eggs, and then once the larvae emerge, they move up into the thorax of the bee and start digesting the wing muscles, and that's what they survive on. And once they're big enough, they kind of pop out between the head and the thorax, and the bee is dead. But when those bees' wing muscles start getting eaten, they basically lose their ability to fly. So this is why this professor was finding them kind of roaming around on the ground in San Francisco. It's estimated that 80% of the hives in the San Francisco Bay Area have this zombie bee happening. I know not this year, but in previous years, I definitely have it or have had it. One of the other ways is because you'll come home at night, and typically when you get home at 9:30 or 10 at night, the bees are all safely tucked away in their hive. But I find bees like hovering around the lights like moths, and they know something's wrong, so they're staying out of their hives, but they're trying to keep warm. So that's one of the ways you can see them. So with bacterial infections and bacterial pathogens, we know something about European and American foul brood. These are two well-known bacterial diseases of the honeybee. The larval sacs, where the bee is developing, basically get reduced to this brown goo that you can see in the slide here. And then that later hardens and produces spores. This is a really terrible thing to happen to your hive, and they typically recommend that you burn everything. Serratia marcescens is another lethal bacterial infection that bees can get. It basically causes septicemia in adult honeybees and potentially in its brood. But we also know that this Serratia bacteria can attack up to 70 different insect species. But it hasn't gotten a lot of study yet. It is interesting, though, that when a bee is exposed to certain pesticides and herbicides, they're much more prone to have this bacterial infection be lethal. Another example of a bacterial infection that they do know is now attacking bumble and mason bees as well as honeybees is something called spiroplasma. So fungus is another pathogen that is attacking the bees. And, just to say up front, all of these different pathogens attacking bees can be lethal or sublethal. It really depends on the health of the bees. So we're going to get into a little bit of some of the stressors on bees and why bees are succumbing to all these pathogens, many of which have been around for a long time, but it's the weakened state our bees are in now that are making them very susceptible to them. Of course, as we all know, fungi generally flourishes in a warm and humid environment. And so bees' nests are both above ground and in hives is perfect for fungus. Few pathogenic fungi of bees have received much attention, but chalkbrood is one that is an important fungal pathogen of the larval honeybees. Larvae that eat the fungal spores are soon killed, and then they're enveloped in a white fungal growth, which is why they call it chalkbrood. As the larval body dies again, that fungus produces spores and just spreads throughout the hive. Mason and leaf-cutting bees are also two solitary native bees that are susceptible to chalkbrood infection. Microsporidia are a highly specialized group of fungal parasites that are transmitted through infectious spores. We know that they cause intestinal infections of honeybees. One of them, Nosema serenae, is basically what you see here. It's dysentery for bees. And if you're a beekeeper and your hives are white like mine, you'll see yellow splotches by the entrance. And that's how you know you probably have a Nosema serenae infection. They have found Nosema serenae in bumblebees recently in England and China, as well as South America. And bumblebees already had a Nosema bombi infection, so they had something similar, but now they also have this one that the honeybees have. So as I mentioned, all these pathogens can be sublethal. Hives can survive having these, but we're finding now that they're less likely to survive because of other things that we've introduced to our bees, including pesticides as number one. So neonicotinoids are the most popular pesticide in the world, although they're now banned in Europe and being phased out in Canada. The EPA in 2019 banned 12 neonicotinoid products used in the USA, but there's still 47 other neonicotinoids that are on the market. Individual states like Connecticut, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Maryland have removed neonicotinoids from the shelves, but they still allow a professional person to apply them. Maine is the only state that has banned them outright, so they don't allow them to be sold to the consumers, nor do they allow professionals to use them. This has changed since I first gave this talk, because I used to tell people, if you remember, Home Depot used to have this flower with a smiley face on it that they would stick in a lot of their plants, and that meant it was treated with a neonicotinoid, which is a systemic pesticide. You just give a little bit of neonicotinoid to the plant and it goes all throughout the system. It's in the pollen, it's in the nectar, it's in the branches, it's in the new leaves that grow even after you've bought it and planted it. It's just systemic. It actually goes into the ground around these plants as well. But I'm happy to report that Lowe's, Home Depot, Walmart, and True Value have phased out neonicotinoid use in their nursery trade. Walmart has gone the extra step and has banned it from people who provide their fresh produce as well. But it's still available, as I mentioned, in the United States, and they're highly toxic to honeybees and to bumblebees. As I mentioned, the neonicotinoids are found in pollen and nectar that is consumed by the pollinators. And you'd think, well, if they can taste it, maybe they would avoid it, but it is a lot like nicotine is to humans. Neonicotinoids become addictive to the bees, so they keep going back for more. So it has mostly sublethal effects, so it doesn't kill them outright, but it does affect their nervous system and their immunity, so it makes them susceptible to other things which do then become lethal. So I'm going to just cite a bunch of studies here just so you kind of know, and some of them do actually cover the effect of neonicotinoids on native solitary bees. They did an 18-year study in the United Kingdom of 62 species of solitary native bees who visited rapeseed. And I didn't know this, but rapeseed is what they call the plant they use to make canola oil. And those plants that were treated with neonicotinoids, they saw a 20% decline in the population of those 62 species. Recent research suggests that neonicotinoids may make honeybees more susceptible to parasites and pathogens, including the intestinal parasite Nosema, which we were just talking about. In another study, scientists found that exposure not only shortened the lifespan of male drone honeybees, it also reduced their sperm count by 39%. A team of Swedish researchers found that traces of neonicotinoids exist in 75% of the honey worldwide. And in the United States, in 86% of our honey. So as I mentioned, neonicotinoids get into pollen and nectar. And so when our honeybees use nectar from neonicotinoid treated plants, probably no surprise that it ends up in our honey. So you and I are getting our fair dose in 86% of our honey. An Imperial College in London study showed that when young bumblebees are fed on pesticide contaminated food, it caused parts of its brain to grow less, leading to adult older bees possessing smaller and functionally impaired brains. And it is an effect that appears to be permanent and irreversible. In a study by the University of Bern in Switzerland, neonicotinoids not only shortened the lifespan of male drones, I already told you that one. And then just this last month in August, or this month, a UC Riverside report published in August took a look at the effect of irrigation on neonicotinoids because they are water soluble. And they were trying to see that if you could kind of flush the neonicotinoids out of plants by using a lot of water, and what effect that would have on the bees. So the UC Riverside report published in August studied the effect of irrigation on neonicotinoid treatment of ornamental plants. Since they're water soluble, the researchers, however, found that 90% of the bees subjected to neonicotinoid insecticides had trouble reproducing afterward, regardless of the irrigation levels. While the increased water made insecticide less potent, the bees were still equally effective. So we're making progress here, but we have a ways to go. So glyphosate, and I know this is maybe going to be a surprise for some people, but the controversial herbicide Roundup has been accused of causing cancer in humans. And now scientists in Texas argue that the world's most popular weed killer could be partly responsible for killing off bee populations around the world. This new study by the scientists at the University of Texas at Austin show that glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup and many other herbicides, basically destroys the specialized gut bacteria in bees. So gut bacteria is sometimes what you call your gut flora and fauna, and it leaves them more susceptible to infection and death from harmful bacteria, one of them being that Sarracenia I was talking about before. So half the bees exposed to Sarracenia survived, but only 1 out of 10 survived if they had been exposed to glyphosate. And perhaps even more scary is that the scientists also point out that the gut bacteria of the bee is very common to the gut bacteria, very similar to the gut bacteria of you and I. Another thing that's stressing our bees is corporate farming. One of the biggest problems in the US is that giant swaths of farmland are devoted to just one crop, and the wildflowers are disappearing. As I mentioned, not all pollen is created the same. And there was a study done in Switzerland by Claude Savedny that showed that if you took one specific kind of pollen and fed it to the generalist bees, that they didn't necessarily thrive on just one kind of pollen. So perhaps one of the reasons they are generalists is they need the mix of nutrients they get from pollen foraging from a bunch of different plants. Native bees do especially well on grasslands, which are more than just grass. But in Europe, 97% of the grasslands have disappeared since World War II. A recent study out of the Netherlands showed that not only are bee populations shrinking, but the bees themselves are getting smaller, specifically the big-bodied females. Scientists have traced this back to land use changes and the loss of habitat, causing upward pressure on bee resources. Interesting, over the same period of study that proves bees are shrinking, Dutch men have grown 10% taller. We also have a stressor on bees, which is the loss of habitat and the fragmentation of habitat. The bees, of course, depend on flowers for food, and nectar provides the carbohydrates, which pollen is their source of protein, and it's necessary for them to rear their young. So flowerless landscapes like mowed lawns with strict weed control, or heavily paved areas of cities and fields and farms with no plant diversity contain very little food for bees, which leads to poor nutrition and compromised immune systems. Nutritionally weakened bees are more susceptible to diseases. Climate change. So one aspect of climate change that is increasingly is in the increasing number of days with extreme heat. A recent study analyzed a large data set of bumblebee occurrences across North America and Europe and found that an increasing frequency of unusually hot days is also increasing the local extinction rate of these native and solitary bees. It's reducing their colonization and site occupancy and decreasing the species diversity within a region. And this was all determined independent of land use changes or conditions, so based only on the weather. It's kind of interesting because bees are outliers in a way. Their peak diversity are in temperate climates. So you get the most bee diversity across North America and Europe, whereas with most other species, their greatest diversity is in the tropics, where it's warm and wet and highly diverse. Bees are just adapted to temperate climates. So, with the more frequent heat waves that's threatening that diversity and threatening these species. So I'm going to tell you about a personal revelation here, and I don't know how many beekeepers we have in the room, but I want to thank Jim Casper as one of the person who sent one of the other studies that I looked at when I was preparing this slide. So although honeybees are really important for agriculture, it's being increasingly discovered that they're also destabilizing natural ecosystems by competing with native bees and bee species that are at risk. Like myself, a lot of people have gotten really into beekeeping, and with the rise of the hobby beekeeper, a strong awareness, lots of people want to save the bees, and like myself, they thought by keeping a honeybee hive, they were saving the bees. And a lot of media attention goes to, honeybees and what's happening with them and colony collapse disorder. But all of this attention to honeybees means that our native bee pollinators are really being neglected and not being studied. And we're not really thinking about how we might help them survive this changing climate and changing world. So they've done a couple studies now on what happens when honey bee keeping becomes more prevalent in an area, or when they bring in agricultural bees, and the results aren't good. The high density of honeybee colonies increases the competition with native pollinators for forage. It puts more pressure on the wild species that are already in decline. Honeybees are extreme generalist foragers. They can monopolize floral resources, and they basically aren't leaving enough to go around. Another really interesting side effect of honeybees is because they are generalist foragers, they're also part of the success of many invasive species. So, when we look around and we see Scotch and French broom and dandelions and bull thistle and echium and Himalayan blackberry and Japanese knotweed, amongst other invasive species, part of the reason they're being so successful here is because they are being pollinated and producing seeds. And that's most likely happening by honeybees, who are, our big generalist foragers here. So I know that's a little controversial, but it's given me some food for thought about my hobby of beekeeping. I did, not by choice, but I decided to keep just one hive this year as opposed to a couple. But I am looking around my garden now and trying to see how many of my bees are visiting my flowers and how many native bees I see, and just trying to be conscious of keeping things in balance. So with that, I'll ask if there's any questions, and I'll have to ask Shireen since I can't see the chat box. And again, please visit our website. There's a lot of great information there.
Hi. Well, that was fascinating, and so much. It was just a crash course in bees. So
and a little long.
But very complete. So lots of great information, and there are some questions in the chat. So let me just go back so I don't miss anything. So give me just a sec. So a person comments that the California fuchsia is now called, and I'm just going to apologize for my pronunciation. Yes, thank you.
As soon as I said Joshneria, I knew it was epilobium.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Anyway.
Yes.
And someone else asks, are yellow jackets worthwhile pollinators? They thought they saw an image of a yellow jacket in a slide. So I think that's a great question.
It is a great question. That actually is not a yellow jacket. That is a ground nesting bee. Yellow jackets you can tell because whereas bees only have the yellow and black markings on their main body, with wasp varieties, they're yellow and black all over. Their legs, their arms, every part of their body have those striations. So that's a good way to tell. They are pollinators of some things. Wasps are pollinators of figs and other things. But they are also, at least for a lot of people, a pest. They're not bees, but they are pollinators. Yeah, I have to say they are pollinators.
Okay, great, thank you. And a person asks if we can visit the UCB garden. It didn't look like it. And honestly, I looked at the website too, and it doesn't appear to be the case. Do you know about that?
You know, they do have workshops throughout the year. I think during COVID, they're not doing that right now. They did have them before the COVID time, and I'm hoping they'll start them up again, maybe once we plateau with the Delta variant. But I would just, keep going to the website or send them a letter and ask them when they're starting their workshops again. But a lot of the information they have, you can learn just from their website. It's a really great resource.
And I noticed you could sign up for a newsletter. So,
Yes.
and that would probably, the newsletter would probably share information about workshops. So a question here is there a list of flowering plants that are not attractive to bees? Like what should we avoid planting essentially?
Yeah, typically hybrids are not, if you like, there are like, if you look at the sort of simpler roses, which do have anthers and you can see the pollen, then that's, clearly a plant that a bee would like. But if you look at the more, exotic hybrid roses, you can see it's very difficult to see where the pollen is. But there is actually on the internet a really good list of plants that don't provide flowers that don't provide pollen. They might provide nectar, but they don't provide pollen, and that's a good place to start. There's a couple lists on the internet you can find there.
Great. Okay. Thank you for that. And so someone kindly, I just want to direct your attention, everyone, to the chat. Someone kindly shared a bee plant list from the Marin Master Gardeners website, and
Oh
many
yeah,
are California natives. So that was very helpful.
it can be
Also,
great.
I'm just going in order here, and I added a couple upcoming Marin Master Gardener talks. So I don't want to take attention here away from James, but I just did want to let everyone know that if you're interested in how to prepare your garden for spring now, there's going to be a talk on September 8th at 4 p.m. And then this is a really nice match for your talk, and we'll answer some of the questions we're getting. It's habitat gardening, bring birds, bees, and butterflies to your yard, and that's October 11th at 1 p.m. So the links there are in the chat. And then we've got a lot of thank yous. A question, is this presentation available? I presume the question means, are we recording it? Yes, we are. It'll be on the Marin County Free Library YouTube website. And I put that in the chat as well. So a question here, rewilding honeybees is being done at a number of Marin locations. Is this a good idea if there's already competition with native bees?
I think I'm not going to judge anyone. It's a personal decision, but whether you rewild them or not, often swarms go off and find a wild place to live too. And I would just say this, I think that we're in a really critical time here in California with our drought, where plant resources and our inability to water plants is going to make it more and more difficult for pollinators. So I think the more honeybees, which are not a native bee, that are competing for resources with our native bees, is, someone's going to be the victor. And as I mentioned in my talk, bees have an advantage because they can basically go to any kind of flower they want, whereas native bees have a shorter lifespan, and they often emerge at a certain time of year where there's only so many flowers in bloom. And so overall, my impression is that the more competition they have, the harder it's going to be for them, and the more stressed they're going to be, and the more susceptible they're going to be to these diseases.
Thank you. The next question is, are there any rules or restrictions about beekeeping in a city?
Typically there are. In my city, in Belvedere, we have none, but I know in neighboring Tiburon, you do have to pay a fee. So I would just go to your city website and check. Sometimes they consider them livestock, like it's the same if you keep goats or bees. So just check your city website, because it does vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
That's a great point. Then you're getting some great thank yous. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. Excellent. Thank you. And another master gardener is suggesting signing up for the quarterly newsletter from the Marin Master Gardeners, which is also a great idea. And I also put the Marin Master Gardeners website in the chat, but you've got it up here. So on your last slide. So before we close and say goodbye, I just want to do a last call for questions. Anyone else have any final questions? Now that we're all bee experts? All right, so fabulous presentation. I couldn't agree more. Another comment. So I am, oh, we're just getting a lot of thank yous. Okay, so I just want to thank you for a wonderful presentation, James. It was just so much information, and I want to thank you all for coming. And I will say good afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
End our meeting. Thanks again. All right, bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.